I think that ultimately art is a reflection of life. I think it's a mirroring of individuals' unique relative experiences, and that relativity is it's the key function in my work. I think that when you enter a practice based on non-hierarchy and with the assumption that any entry point has its own unique relative advantages, that you understand that there's no longer significance placed on any one particular departure point. And so I think that comes through very clearly in my work, through the materials that I choose to use, my engagement with those materials, my engagement with exhibition space and with the viewers. And I think ultimately the relationship that I generate with the viewer is something that is open-ended. There's an intentional enfranchisement of the viewer, where there's an entry point, and there's also space and room for interpretation. I think that in all art, and particularly in my practice, I think that at best, an artist's intentions could be met by the viewer, but that is not something that can be assumed. I think that's something that at best, an artist's intentions are met by the viewer. The world is a relative environment. I think that art is ultimately a reflection of that relative environment. And it's relative to all of our individual unique experiences. And I think that an artist's role is to translate their environment through their relative experience into a practice. And at best, they can hope that that practice is met and received on a similar level that they had intended for. I think that ultimately, any given work of art is outside of the artist's control. The interpretation is ultimately up to the viewer. And there's a real enfranchisement in that statement, because what that means is that a viewer is required for the completion of a piece of work. And so that relative experience that the viewer brings is equally as valid as the relative experience that the artist brings to the creation of the work. So ultimately, I think that my work is about that relationship of relativity, that relationship of my intentions being met by the intentions of materials, space, viewers. And I think that there's a lack of hierarchy in my practice, where I intentionally give significance and weight and power to all of these available constituents. And ultimately, all that I can hope for is that I can allude to the philosophical undercurrents that run through my practice, and that they can be interpreted by a viewer. Two people I think have been the biggest influence in my practice at this point. I think it would probably start with John Cage. I think that on the surface there's a real relationship of form and rhythm in our practices that are engaged with this sort of relationship to silence and this relationship to non-obstruction. For example, John Cage's piece 433, this idea of not giving preference to music or sound, that relationship of non-hierarchy. I think that the engagement with material and form it's a similar entry point, and it's been inspiration in my work. And I think that in a sense, also has a connection to Duchamp's writing maze, which has equally viable conversation in my practice. My practice is a celebration. I think it's a celebration of the life that I've been lucky enough to have and to lead as an artist. I just want to be a good person, and I want to build relationships with people, and I think that's evident in my relationship to the viewer, and that's evident in the way that I make decisions. And ultimately, I think my practice is a celebration. It's a celebration of human relationship. It's a celebration of life. My studio in New York, I've cultivated this real environment that's it's very particular to my practice, and it's ultimately an extension of my practice. And I think it's anyone who's ever been there would know that it's a vital part of my work. And I think that there's a certain there's a certain level of comfort that comes with working in that sort of safe environment that you've cultivated for yourself. And I think while it's incredibly beneficial and essential for my practice in particular, I think that there's a lot to be learned, there's a lot to be said for stepping out of that safety zone and stepping out of that comfortable environment. And especially in a place like Bolzano, where there's this there's a real silence here, there's a real quietude, there's a real quietness here. And I think that it forces you to look at yourself in a different way, look at your practice in a different way. And I think that there's a real lesson to be learned in that sort of, there's a lesson to be found in that silence. When you come from a place like New York, where there's constant engagement with your peers, with your environment, I think that there's something to be said for stripping all that away and having a sort of more honest relationship with your practice and with yourself. And I think that it's very vulnerable to be so exposed to yourself. And I think that that's something that's invaluable. And it's difficult to find that in a place like New York, and it's much easier to find that in a place like Bolzano, to work in this sort of quiet environment. And I hope to learn about my practice, and I hope to learn about myself and my relationship to my work, and hopefully I can bring something back to New York from that quietness that's, opens a new chapter in the work.